This video is part of the GRESB Assessment Training Program. It will cover how to complete specific aspects of the Infrastructure Asset Assessment Performance Component using the GRESB Assessment Portal. We'll go through indicators aspect by aspect, providing guidance and examples of how to report on each indicator in the assessment portal. For an overview of the structure of the indicators in the performance component, refer to the lesson titled Asset Assessment Performance Component Structure. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to complete the aspects, greenhouse gas emissions, and air pollution in the performance component of the infrastructure asset assessment. After this lesson, we recommend that you take the lessons on other indicators in the performance component that are relevant to your entity. The first aspect we'll discuss in this lesson is greenhouse gas emissions. There is one indicator containing 3 tables, followed by some indicator-specific questions. Emissions can be divided into 3 scopes. Scope 1 are emissions that are generated directly from sources that are owned or controlled by the asset. This could be on-site from industrial processes or through the consumption of fuel such as diesel in a van owned by the asset, or the release of carbon dioxide from gas-fired electricity generation. Scope 2 are indirect emissions from the purchase of energy such as electricity or district heating. And finally, Scope 3 emissions are indirect emissions that arise in the asset's value chain. Assets should determine which parts of Scope 3 emissions are relevant to their reporting. Entities should only answer the question on whether they can report greenhouse gas emissions with yes if they can report their emissions for all of the mandatory metrics in the first table. The first table covers the absolute emissions of the entity. All emissions should be reported in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The Scope 1 emissions are broken down into emissions from combustion of fuels, process emissions, and fugitive emissions. Scope 3 emissions are calculated through a separate table, and the total of these will pull through to the first table. The scored metric for entities whose primary sector is renewable power is emissions avoided. The scored metric for all other entities is the net GHG emissions, which is Scope 1 plus 2. To obtain full points for the indicator, entities should provide targets for the reporting year and a future year for the scored metric. Note that the targets for the scored metric are not calculated automatically. The second table allows reporting of the breakdown of Scope 3 emissions. Select yes if you can report on at least one Scope 3 emission metric. The metrics listed here are based on the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. Entities can report those metrics that they have deemed as relevant following the GHG protocol, and the total flows through to the Scope 3 metric in the previous table. Note that in relation to exceptions, Scope 3 emission generating activities are not considered ancillary activities for the entity. So even though you may report your Scope 3 emissions, do not record the activities that generate the Scope 3 emissions as being an exception to your reporting boundary. Scope 3 emissions are not scored. The final table is the intensities table. Greenhouse gas intensity metrics are provided for comparison purposes and are intended to be used for scoring in future years. The reporting year performance data for this table is calculated automatically based on the values provided in the tables above. Targets may be added. Intensities are calculated for gross greenhouse gas emissions, which is based on the metric total Scope 1 plus 2, and net greenhouse gas emissions, which is based on the metric net greenhouse gas emissions, Scope 1 plus 2. In addition to the tables, there are several questions that relate to the methodology behind the reported emissions and targets. The first question relates to Scope 2 emissions. This is based on the guidance in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The location-based approach calculates emissions using a regional emissions factor. For example, the average emissions factor for the electricity in France. These can be obtained from regional or national governments or through the International Energy Agency. The market-based approach calculates emissions using a market-specific emissions factor. These are typically provided by energy suppliers and can sometimes be found on invoices. For example, an energy supplier who sources a large portion of its energy from renewables may have a lower emissions factor than a regional average. The second question relates to science-based targets, which are targets set in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement and that have been approved by the Science Based Targets Initiative. Indicate for which metrics the science-based target was set, if any. Neither the question on Scope 2 methodology nor on science-based targets are scored. The next aspect is air pollution. Entities can provide data on air pollution during the reporting year and any targets that have been set, as well as any non-compliance that occurs. Non-compliance is a mandatory metric to report and is also scored. If the entity does not know whether any non-compliances took place during the reporting year, it should answer no to this indicator rather than to report 0. To obtain full points for the indicator, entities should provide targets for the reporting year and a future year for the scored metric. Thank you for taking the time to complete this lesson. We hope that it helped you get a better understanding of the Asset Assessment Performance component and prepared you to complete this component accurately. We recommend that you take the lessons on other indicators in the performance component that are relevant to your entity next. If you have any questions, please contact the GRESB Help Desk at gresb.com/contact.